Hello. As I mentioned a few weeks ago, I thought today I'd bring forward one of the topics I normally covered when I used to do my old Conquered and the Proud lecture series, and bring it forward, coincide roughly with Easter time. And that's to look at the Roman attitude towards the early Christians, the early church, and of course most spectacularly when it comes to the persecutions under Nero and then into the 2nd century AD and into the third. Why these happened? Why did the Romans respond? Because generally speaking, the Romans are remarkably tolerant of other religion. Now we'll look another day more generally at religion in the Roman Empire, both the Roman concepts, what's happening in the provinces. It's a fascinating subject, but it's also quite a complicated one because a lot of the evidence comes from things that are archaeological. So you have the remains of temples, whether it's a grand one of what we consider to be a classical temple, or whether it's the rather simpler in plan but quite distinctive Romano-British temples, for instance, you get in this part of the world. That's a building. It tells us a little bit from its design, from its layout, what it's meant to be and how it's meant to work, but it doesn't necessarily tell you too much about the emotional element for the people involved in the cult. And obviously there are political aspects to cults in terms of priests in most communities tend to come from the elite. You have added on to this the imperial cult, again, something we'll deal with another time. I think there was a comment about that not too long ago. We will get there. I'll try and get to all these things in time. Or you have inscriptions, dedications, somebody asking for something, giving an offering as a part of a vow, I've asked for this, it seems to have worked out, thank you very much. Those can give a rather sort of transactional impression that you basically say, well, I'd like this, here, god, goddess, whatever it might be, if you get me, if you give me a safe journey, if you allow my business to prosper, if I recover from this disease, then I will give you as a reward so and so. This is obviously a sacrificial culture, not too familiar to most of us in the modern world. The idea of making offerings, but particularly animal sacrifice, is something we find rather alien, though again, it's a lot of human societies have done this for large parts of human history and have had no problem at all with it. But it's a little bit alien to us, and there is a great danger when you come to religion, whether you're looking at sort of more general different cults, the mixed cults of the Roman Empire, to judge it entirely from your own point of view. So if you are a religious person yourself, if you're Christian, Jewish, whatever it might be, there is a tendency to look in ancient religions for the same sort of experience you have, whether this is a deeply emotional one, whether this is a pragmatic one, whether this is one of familiarity. I've done this because that was how I was brought up and I'm always going to do it because it seems to work, and also I'm used to it, it's reassuring. Or you can have the more skeptical view. If you don't have formal religion, if you're there's a tendency to think, well, anybody who does believe in this is got to be a little bit dim, and you can see this. Polybius talks about the Romans being apparently too superstitious, too over the top in their rituals and their adherence to them, but then effectively concludes that this is how the elite controls the poorer citizens. So most of the views that we have in the modern world were there in the ancient world, to all the different degrees. The problem is when we have less evidence for a lot of these cults, and that's even before you've got onto the mystery religions, Mithraism, this sort of thing, where the whole point was that nobody wrote down and nobody explained what this was all about. It was secret to its initiates, even at the time. Then understanding exactly its real nature is very, very hard. And you have to be quite careful because it's quite easy to build up a big theory. Oh, this is what it means, and you can see these links. But remember, people are varied, and many of these cults spread over a wide area in a long period of time, so that they can mean different things to different people, even though some of the symbolism, some of the names will appear to be the same from us at this distance. Generally speaking, the Romans absorb other religions. When they come to an area, they tend to Romanize, if you can use the term, a lot of the cults. So you have Sulis Minerva. There seems to be a Celtic goddess at the springs of what's now Bath. Sulis, they associate her with Minerva, a familiar goddess. And you have this, it's difficult to tell. The cult of Coventina and the nymphs up on Hadrian's Wall is that a local cult that the Romans have picked up upon, or is it what we might term broadly Celtic, but actually from Celts from the continent rather than from northern Britain? Or, how far is this Roman troops, the Roman state, immigrants coming from the Roman Empire for business, for whatever, creating something that they're familiar with, and perhaps using an existing practice, but perhaps not. It's a complicated issue, and we'll come on to all of these things, as I say, when we look more generally at religion. But obviously the basic fact of the Greeks, the Romans, and most peoples in the ancient world is that they are polytheistic. There are lots of powers, gods, goddesses, spirits, nymphs, spirits of a particular place, of a particular thing, a particular activity, and they are accepted. And individuals may pay much more attention to some of these, and not necessarily spend all your time finding out every possible god and goddess out there and trying to win them over to your side. But it does mean that it's much easier when you come to another area to accept the gods and goddesses of that region. And there is this assumption that there are particular deities that seem to be more important, more influential in a particular place, because that's where they're worshipped and that's where they're revered. So on the whole, there are very few cases where the Romans go anywhere and deliberately destroy an existing cult. They do appear to suppress, or at least try to suppress, some of the Carthaginian cults. That's partly because of the extinction of the Carthaginian state after the Third Punic War. It's also because of the associations in the minds of Greeks and Romans, and there's a video on this before, of child sacrifice, this sort of thing. But you get rumours of that in later sources for Roman Africa. That it's the thing that people certainly fear is still going on behind the scenes, even if they're not sure about this. Another famous case would be the Druids in Britain and Gaul, though that happens gradually. When you look at Julius Caesar, he doesn't present the Druids really in a negative way. I mean, his excursus on Gallic culture and Germanic culture, which comes in book 6, and you feel a lot of it is padding, because this is a year where he's really busy campaigning and doesn't have time to write up lots of scrappy little actions and burning down villages and repression and this sort of thing. It's not big battles, big drama, big decisions by the commander. It's grueling, attritional, rather nasty warfare, and he's busy, so he hasn't got time to write it. So you get this where you talk about it's not, again, directly associated with the Druids, but the Druids are held up as a big thing within regulating the customs of Gallic tribes and between Gallic tribes. You have, the sacrifices of human beings in wicker men and this sort of thing. All that stuff comes in. But Caesar, one of his key allies amongst the Aedui is a Druid, and we hear about this chap. Cicero met him when he was on an embassy to Rome, and conversed with him quite happily, and so he didn't see him as this sort of raving lunatic. Sadly, although he tells us they did talk about his ideas, Cicero doesn't tell us any of that, doesn't write any of it down. So Druidism is a hard thing to understand, as we'll deal with when we look at Roman Britain, where it's obviously an issue. The repression comes more under Augustus and Tiberius, when it's outlawed, and you have a local aristocrat who's executed for having something called a Druid's egg, some sort of totem, when he's at a trial. Leading into Britain, where you have the attack on Anglesey, the island of Mona, which deliberately targets the Druids, their shrines, but again, we'll come on to that next time. So Druidism is seen, at least in some places, sometimes as something that threatens the state. It might be that human sacrifice association that you also get with the Carthaginians. It might be that there is a political element, that these are seen as people who rally resistance against you, or it might be a combination of those things. But it is interesting that in Gaul, it takes a generation or two before this repression becomes more direct, and it could be that the attitude in Britain is influenced by that earlier experience. And on both sides, if the Druids have worked out that these Romans, don't like some of the things we're doing, don't like our influence, don't like our role, they're trying to create a different sort of elite within Gallic society, then that would obviously encourage hostility on their part as well. Anyway, look at all that when we come to Roman Britain. There are a few exceptions, and one of the biggest comes in the early 2nd century BC, and we didn't really get to talk about it when we were doing the chronological account, and I won't do too much today, but this is the Bacchic cult, the cult of Dionysus in the Greek form. And there is a panic when the Romans come to feel, or a substantial body of opinion comes to feel, that secretly this cult has spread throughout society, and that they're getting up to all sorts of unpleasant activities and subversive activities in private. And this, the threat is this is going to overthrow the state. You have these moments of panic before in ancient cities, city-states. I mean, think of the 415 BC, the case of the desecration of the Herms in Athens before the expedition to Sicily, and then how this spreads into a sort of general witch hunt of people who've supposedly been reenacted the Eleusinian mysteries in their homes or parodying them and all this sort of thing. So you get these moments when society becomes nervous and it lashes out. Livy gives us an account where he talks about, his description of the Bacchic cult. There were initiations which at first were imparted only to a few, but they soon began to be widespread among men and women. The pleasures of drinking and feasting were added to the religious rites to attract a large number of followers. When wine had inflamed the feelings, and at night and the mingling of the sexes and of different ages had extinguished all power of moral judgment, all sorts of corruption began to be practised, since each person had ready to hand the chance of gratifying the particular desire to which he was naturally inclined. The corruption was not confined to one kind of evil, the promiscuous violation of free men and of women. The cult was also a source of supply of false witnesses, forged documents and wills, and perjured evidence, dealing also in poisons and in wholesale murders among the devotees, and sometimes ensuring that not even the bodies were found for burial. Many such outrages were committed by craft, and even more by violence, and the violence was concealed because no cries for help could be heard against the shriekings, the banging of drums, and the clashing of cymbals in the scene of debauchery and bloodshed. So this is 186 BC, and the Romans devote a magistrate, lots of inquiries, their arrests, their executions. They basically panicked, and there is this sense that a couple of things that we'll see later on when we look at Roman reactions to Christians, this sense, we don't know who these people are. They meet in secret. They could be anybody. They could be your son, my cousin, my brother, my neighbour. We don't know who they are. They do things in secret, and that's got to be a sign that what they're doing is something that is shameful, is terrible, and then that allows your imagination to spread in terms of, well, they're up to all sorts of weird sexual practices, and then it's worse, they're murdering people, they're poisoning, it's spreading out. This dreadful disease is almost spreading through society and threatens to overthrow society. And deep down there is this sense that, well, the Romans, we've been so successful. Not too long ago we've defeated Hannibal in that great struggle that pushed us to the brink. We do this because we honour the gods with great care. You have the stone, the Magna Mater stone, brought to Rome during that war. There is an emphasis on making sure the rituals are correct. Famously go back to the First Punic War and the Admiral Claudius, or who throws the sacred chickens overboard because they won't eat in the way he wants and give the good omen for fighting a battle, and of course loses and is then vilified afterwards. So there's an element that this might undermine that special relationship you have with the gods and goddesses that is the reason why they care for Rome and therefore Rome is prosperous. But also a more personal element on what's going on. Am I in danger? Is my son going to murder me because he's been corrupted by this weird foreign? There's a great emphasis, the symbols, the incense, this was a cult that in various forms had an unfamiliar, rather more Eastern flavour to it and its rituals. But it's something that worries Romans. It's different, it's weird, and you could see that in modern reactions when the tabloids get excited about some secret society or cult. Yes, some of these do terrible things, but there's often an element where rumour, gossip, hysteria claims all sorts of things that aren't necessarily true, because people are frightened and nervous. So you've got this situation where every now and again the Romans respond to a cult in a hostile way, but it's very, very rare. And the scale of persecution of Christians and the prolonged duration of the state's hostility at times, anyway, to Christians within Roman society last longer. So you've got to look at reasons why are the Romans behaving in this way. Because on the whole, it comes back to this essential polytheistic attitude. Adding an extra god or goddess to your pantheon, your general system, isn't a problem. No one is claiming that there is just Jupiter, he is supreme, and that's it. There are no other gods and goddesses. There's always been this assumption that there are plenty out there. And this is an attitude that when we come to look at the increasing political role of the church that builds up to Constantine, that we can sometimes be a little bit too theological in what we define as the Christian population, when perhaps we ought to be looking at it from a traditional Roman set of assumptions about what you can believe and not believe. So anyway, that's something we'll come back to a little bit today, maybe more in the future. Sources for all of this they're decent, but they're limited. Obviously, if you're looking at the early origins of the church, then you have its own version, or a version presented by part of the church, with the Gospels, the Book of Acts, and then the letters of the New Testament. Now, obviously, those are written with a particular purpose in mind. This is somebody who is trying to say, this is the truth, this is what you should believe, this is how you should change your life, and they're going to present it in a way that's favourable to that. It doesn't have to be a cynical thing. This is what people believe, so that's what they're doing. The dating traditionally of the Gospels has been marked to the 70s because he mentions the destruction of Jerusalem, so it's assumed, well, that must have happened afterwards. And then Matthew and Luke, with John coming very near the end of the 1st century AD, because of its different nature. It's not one of the synoptic Gospels and all that sort of thing. There's not really good evidence for any of that. This is basically the consensus of scholarship that's built up over generations, and it's easier not to challenge it, because if you do, you've got nothing to put in its place. There was a while ago, based on the script, they found a fragment of papyrus with Matthew's Gospel on a part of it that they dated to earlier. They had before, but again, you can argue about how far can you rely upon handwriting style, this sort of thing, to do that. Just as a reminder, the earliest fragment of Virgil's Aeneid comes from Masada, post-siege, so late 1st century, and there's a second bit that's actually written from the Vindlander tablets that's sort of very end of the century. Most ancient texts do not appear in their original first edition equivalent, or the original manuscript, but in much, much later copies, because that's how these things spread. It is before the printing press, so you have to produce a copy, then copy another from the copy, and so on and so on, and to spread this, and then it's the survival chances of these fairly fragile and easily combustible things. So we are, generally speaking, scholarship is a lot harder to please, in a sense, when it talks about something like the religious documents of the New Testament, because people don't want to be seen. Either they'd like to see, well, I don't believe in all of this, so let's just make sure this is really late and I can just you treat it as a text, it doesn't mean much. Or they're worried that they're going to be seen as, well, I do believe in this, but I'm trying too hard, and I'm not losing my scholastic independence by trying to make sure that. Essentially, we don't know. I think the dates that we have as the consensus, so 70 for Mark, perhaps 80s for Matthew and Luke, and then 90s, late 90s for John's Gospel. They're probably not later than that. They might be earlier, but who knows? And then you can argue over authorship and what information they had at their disposal. Ultimately, various attempts, textual analysis, to say, oh, this has been amended, you can see a different style here. It's a very old-fashioned approach that you see. I think it still comes in a little bit from the Greek side of things when people are looking at Greek history, but with Roman history, most scholars are pretty sceptical of this, because it's very hard to tell with something that's been written, whether there are other things. So the other sources, and these are the ones we'll really deal with today, I want to look very much at what the ordinary Roman authors are saying about the early Christians, rather than what the Christians are saying about themselves, because that helps you to understand why the empire reacts in the ways that it does. So you have Tacitus, you've got Pliny the Younger, Suetonius, Lucian gives a very cynical view, but again, that's interesting to see, what are people mocking, what are they laughing at. You then get much later, and these are 2nd and into 3rd centuries, Acts of the Christian Martyrs, some of them are later, that again have a particular purpose. They are celebrating, if that's the right word, praising the courage of those who've died for the faith, and they tend to emphasize the gruesome aspect of what's gone on, but also the encourage the faithfulness of those who suffer. But interestingly, in most of those accounts, you also get the people who rat on their fellow members of their church, or who run away and say, no, that's fine, I don't believe that anymore, I'm off. So it does present an interesting view, and in many respects a very human view, that people aren't perfect, and the emphasis on the ones who are martyred is often based around the ones who weren't, and the ones who decided very clearly that they weren't going to take these risks. So that's quite interesting. You've got Eusebius writing much later, Tertullian defending the doctrine and all this. So all of these are interesting, but obviously those again are coming from a particular point of view. Basically speaking, somebody like Tacitus or Pliny has not probably the best understanding of the Christians as a group, but very much sees them as an outsider. So from them you get a sense of how a member of the Roman elite would see this cult. So we're not going to talk about the Gospels, that's just too big a thing. And anyway, most of it comes down to, well, you can't prove it or disprove it and that sort of thing. The basic aspects, the chronology, the existence of Jesus, all this sort of thing, there is no good reason for rejecting that. Tacitus confirms this is somebody executed in the reign of Tiberius. It's all I've talked before about the Testimonium Flavianum, the piece of Josephus that mentions Jesus and then Jesus's brother later on, and talks about the crucifixion very briefly, because that text does seem to have been tampered with later on by some Christian who's copying it, so therefore it's difficult to know what was there. The whole thing is problematic, and you start trying to second guess, well, what if it was entirely an invention? Surely they would have invented something more clear and more positive. If it wasn't, then how much of it is true? I think what you probably can conclude that this, as far as somebody like Josephus was concerned, who is a member of high priestly family, the elite within Jewish society, even though obviously his role in the rebellion is ambiguous, that Jesus himself, the Christians, his followers, were not very important. And that's the lesson to take from it. It's partly because he is trying to defend his own people in a Roman world that's very hostile after the big rebellion. So the Jewish Antiquities is all about showing the ancient nature and the details of Jewish doctrine, Jewish history, in a way that a Greek audience would understand, a Greco-Roman audience would understand, and saying, well, you should respect our traditions because these are really old, and in some cases older than yours, and that generally speaking, we've been decent, good members of the empire and all this sort of thing. There's also a vast literature on all of this. One day maybe we'll look at Pontius Pilate's governorship, and within that we'll look at the gospel accounts of the crucifixion, how they present Roman government and all that sort of thing. Essentially it's a presentation of different lobby groups, and the governor who needs these elites to administer the empire, the province on a day-to-day basis, has to make sure that they're reasonably happy with him. There can be some friction, but he's got to work with them. So it's an element of compromise, and it's much easier to execute this chap than upset a lot of established and important people who are going to be there next month, next year, and so on throughout the rest of my governorship, and they're the ones who can complain to me, to Tiberius. So it's not initiated by Pontius Pilate, by the Roman state, the representative of the Roman state, in the way it's presented. It's an internal thing, but you have the emphasis on claim to kingship, loyalty to Caesar and all this sort of thing. It's interesting, think back to that inscription, the only one we have of Pilate, that he's built this Tibereum, this building to celebrate the emperor in some shape or form. And, this is Tiberius, you've had Sejanus and his career. Now, whether that building is built while you're trying to assure Sejanus that, look, I'm a very loyal chap, loyal to you, loyal to the emperor as well, and all this sort of thing, or whether it's after Sejanus has fallen and you're building it to show, no, I look at me, you can trust me, I'm the emperor's man, always have been, true blue, this sort of thing. You've got some of, this is a time when governors can be a little bit more insecure even than usual. In the Acts, you get persecutions of the early Christians. They present this as done more by the Jewish community than by the Roman state, though the Roman state sometimes gets involved. Now, again, you can argue about why they're presenting that. Those are big issues. we can't really deal with. So let's come back to the Roman view. As I say, we've had that 2nd century BC, the repression of the Bacchic cult that seems, as far as the Romans are concerned, to be successful. They don't worry about it anymore. You know, that's it, that's done, isn't a problem anymore. Obviously, the other group that are directly relevant to the Christians, because for a very long time, quite understandably, the Christians are simply seen as another Jewish sect, is the Jewish population of the empire, particularly in the provinces. I mean, there's obviously Judea, but you have the substantial Jewish population in Egypt, especially in Alexandria, but also in other areas around there. And you know, there's quite a big Jewish community in Rome, elsewhere. This is a people who are clearly distinct. You know, they are, more so than other groups in the ancient world, they have their rituals that mark them as something different, something set apart, so that they'll only eat certain things. The emphasis you have seems to be particularly strong in the late 1st century BC, 1st century AD, all this sort of thing. The emphasis on purity and things that you cannot do if you are going to be Jewish and follow your faith, that means that you can't join in with some of the aspects of civic life, of community life within an ancient city. Which is less of a problem where you're somewhere like Alexandria, where you've got a big Jewish quarter where you can basically do your thing. But nevertheless, it's, for the many that are scattered around, it marks them out as different and distinctive. So you have... where have we got? Oh yeah, there we go. Something that is interesting. I mean, if you look at Tacitus' introduction in the histories to the Jewish rebellion, where he sort of does this quick summary of what he considers to be Jewish history, you know, it's wildly inaccurate. He's clearly not that interested to find out the details, and he's just fitting it into a sort of generic Greco-Roman model. So, you know, Moses goes and meets Jupiter Ammon out in the desert and all this sort of thing. It's all very hasty, very confused, not really that interesting, which of course is a warning to us when he tells us things about other societies where we don't have an equivalent tradition, to have a sense of, you know, this is clearly not what these people think they're doing and why. But the problem is, again, you know, so often we're left with just the Tacitus, just the Roman side, the version of what a people think, how they act, what the history was. You get... where are we? More into the 2nd century, and there are some restrictions. Obviously, the Jewish rebellion in Judea is a big, big deal and becomes celebrated because it's the great victory of Vespasian and Titus. It's their great foreign victory. It's the big triumph they can hold early on in Vespasian's reign. You know, you've won through a civil war. It's a lot better to emphasize fighting somebody foreign. Now, obviously, it's foreigners who are part of your empire who rebelled, which makes it a bit messy, but nevertheless, you can depict them as non-Romans. So, and there is an emphasis that because the Jews have their God, a single God, and deny that other gods and goddesses exist and have real power, they're edging towards atheism by the ancient understanding, because you're basically saying, you know, if you want to worship Sulis, Minerva, Dionysus, whatever it might be, Isis, let alone Jupiter, Juno, all these sort of things, but you're not doing all of them every time. You're not denying their existence. If you start to say there is only one God has power, then by implication, and this is something that will be pushed even more and upset people even more when the Christians start to express this, if you're saying there is only one God and the rest don't exist, or they're demons, or they're false, they're sinister, then that's basically telling everybody that all their beliefs are wrong, and this is not something that people tend to react to in a friendly way. So there's an element of that. There is, from the Digest, we get a law of the 2nd century AD, rescript of the divine Antoninus: the Jews are allowed to circumcise only their own sons. If anyone performs the operation on a national of another race, he is liable to the same penalty as for castration. And Hadrian and others have built up this quite harsh laws against castration, people wanting to sell slaves as units, slave boys, rather than as whole and intact, or doing it for religious purposes. It's seen of as, a bit too weird, a bit too cruel. It's part of that Hadrian in the same way, there's legislation under him that you can't just abandon an elderly slave. You've got to make some provision for him, or the state will. You've got to look after your property. They are more than just an object, a tool. It's still quite limited, but there are some rights for slaves. You've had, obviously, the tax imposed on the Jews post-rebellion. There are restrictions, and there is that sense, but what they seem to be worried about more is not what the Jews do when they're just Jews together, and their rituals, and their practices. Yes, you don't, if you're Tacitus, you find that's all weird and strange, and you're not really that interested. You certainly find it rather alien, but you don't care if they just go and do it in the privacy of their own home, or their synagogue, or whatever it might be, and don't cause trouble. The concern is when they start to convince other people to act in the same way. So the law is more about conversion, about adding people to the Jewish faith, making others Jewish. That's a bit worrying. That's where the Roman state starts to get concerned. So you can have this small group of unusual people with their distinctive beliefs, but the vast majority are doing the proper traditional thing, and therefore, this isn't really much of a problem. So you have this general hostility to the Jews, this sense that they are not necessarily loyal subjects of the empire all the time, that their beliefs are perverse, why don't you eat pork and all this sort of thing, why are you saying our gods are false or our gods are weak, only yours is the one that counts, that's just bad manners. These sorts of things, they're seen as an odd fringe group, and there are moments of persecution, but not in that organised a way, at least as far as we can tell. Though again, post-70, the literary sources do break down in a way. So Eusebius talks about investigations under Domitian into the Christians and the Jews and this sort of thing. But he's writing centuries later. Has he made this up? Is this a real, is it based on some source from the time? We don't really know. So let's come on to the persecutions. And, we better say a little bit about the early church first. Archaeologically, it's almost invisible. We talk about the church, and obviously in later centuries, Christian churches are very distinctive buildings that you can see the remains, you can tell that's what it is, and that gives an indication there's a community around that area. Whether you're looking at the Gospels or other sources, it's clear that the early Christian groups meet in people's houses. So it's just a house. You can't tell from that. You have the baptistry from Juria-Ropus, which is 3rd century AD. It might be a little bit earlier, but that's probably what it is, with wall paintings on, this sort of thing. It's smaller, it's obviously less public than the synagogue, but it's probably not so very secret as all that. These are a group that are meeting in places that are not anything we can identify. They are not, on the whole, setting up inscriptions. I mean, you get bits of graffiti and things in the catacombs and all this sort of stuff. You get, supposedly, these secret symbols and this sort of thing. But there isn't a lot anywhere, because it isn't an activity that leaves that physical trace at this stage. So it's very hard from an independent source to judge how the church is spreading, where it is, where there are groups of Christians at any time, and what sort of numbers there are. And you end up, it's very, it's got to be conjectural when you start talking about that sort of thing. The first big occasion where they come to state attention is under Nero, and of course the Great Fire in 64, when you have Tacitus has very little sympathy for them. But the way he tells the story is that you've had this terrible fire burning through, destroying lots of Rome. People have lost their homes, they've lost their possessions. People have died, but also, far more are now destitute. And the rumour gets around that Nero has started the fire, or has ordered it, because he wanted to clear the centre of the town. The fact that he's planning this and starts to build his golden house, this great project, a lovely luxurious palace for himself, not very tactful when people are on the streets. And then all the stories about him choosing the moment, the backdrop of these the flames on the horizon to sing of the fall of Troy and all this sort of thing. True or not, people are believing it. These are rumors around, and Nero doesn't like being held responsible. He feels he's becoming unpopular. So, according to Tacitus, to scotch the rumour, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate, and the pernicious superstition was checked for a moment, only to break out once more, not merely in Judea, but in the capital itself. Nero has the Christians arrested, and then you have all these mass executions, people being set on fire. It's weird, sort of Quo Vadis country and all this sort of thing. Hollywood, you can see the influence in movies like Gladiator and this sort of thing of these gruesome martyrdoms and punishments of criminals. That's the whole point, public punishment to be a warning as well as entertainment. You don't want to do these sorts of things. You don't want to break the rules because this is what happens to you. However, Nero doesn't get what he wants because the crowd actually starts to sympathise with them. In spite of a guilt which had earned the most exemplary punishment, there rose a sentiment of pity due to the impression they were being sacrificed not for the welfare of the state, but to the ferocity of a single man. So Tacitus is basically saying, these are a group of really strange weirdos who've probably done crimes for which they should be punished, but they hadn't set fire to Rome. Now, you can have, there were all these theories knocking around that there was some sort of millennial expectation that maybe they were. There's not good evidence for it, but the odds are Rome catches fire a lot. The odds are this was probably an accident, and it is not a safe space. It's built very badly, and it's crowded. And once the fire starts, it's going to spread. So Tacitus says, well, it's not that these are great people or anything like that. So he doesn't really have any sympathy with them other than the fact that they are being punished for something they didn't do, and they are being punished particularly cruelly for something they didn't do. And he says that's the reaction to it. So it's interesting. He calls Pilate a procurator. We know from the inscription the title at that stage was still prefect. It becomes formally procurator a few years later, around about 40-ish, probably under Claudius. So that's not a big deal, but that's, again, if you want the independent account of, well, this is, we've heard of this man, he was executed. Again, someone of the status of carpenter from Galilee is not a big deal in Roman ways of looking at the world. This man is not a Roman citizen, hence the fact he's crucified, obviously. But also, this is not somebody from the rich, from the well-educated, from all this sort of group that you would think more. He's not part of the elite of the province. And although they're not the same as the elite of Rome, obviously, nevertheless, they're the ones you might have some consideration for, might find interesting. So it isn't a big deal, but the cult has obviously spread and is popping up. So why are they seen as these outsiders? Then it's really a question of, again, even more than the Jews, they are saying that there is their God and nobody else's. All of yours are false. And that's offensive, but also there's the concern, which we'll see later on, that if you say that, then if you're letting that happen within your city, what do the old traditional gods that have made your city prosperous in the first place, what are they thinking about this? Is this a part of breaking that special relationship you have, this respect you've shown generation after generation, and the reason why you've prospered? Have you actually lost that because you're allowing this other group to come in and say, deny the existence, the power of all this? It comes back to these ideas of status, of being treated in the way you deserve, that go right back to Homer, are deeply embedded in Greco-Roman society. So that's one aspect that's offensive. The other thing is about the Christians, and Tacitus talks about this a little bit in another passage, and it again comes in elsewhere. It's a little bit like the Bacchic cult back in the 2nd century BC. The Jews are a race. They are clearly defined. You are, in most cases, born to be Jewish, raised by Jewish parents. You follow these particular rules, and this marks you out as separate. And you have a very long tradition. That's the whole point of Josephus writing the Antiquities, to say to everybody, even if you didn't know it, look, this is thousands of years old. We have been following our practices. This is our tradition. It's older than yours. We were there before Alexander, before the Achaemenid Persians, all of this sort of thing. And the Romans and the Greeks, they can respect that idea that something is old, that there is a cult that has been like that as far as anybody can remember. And that gives it, even if you find it a bit strange, it gives it status. The Christians have come along and they're following somebody who's been executed in living memory, in the 30s. You're following a leader who, as far as the attitudes of the state are concerned, is a nobody, and has then been executed by a Roman governor doing his job. For whatever reason, Tacitus isn't really that bothered to look at the reason the governor has decided this is necessary. Therefore, that's how it is. So the Jews are a race, and you can respect that even if you still don't like them and you repress them to some extent. The problem with the Christians is that once they are perceived as being slightly more than a Jewish sect, and obviously there are Jewish groups as well, trying to make very clear that these people are not us. Who are they? It's like the Bacchus cult. They could be anybody. They'll look exactly the same. They won't act in most circumstances in a way that's different from any other citizen, any other neighbour, any other inhabitant of your city. They could be absolutely anyone. But what do? They go and they meet in secret, and they carry out certain rituals. But what are they? What are people getting up to in the dark, in the night, in these clandestine meetings? That's then coming into very much the same territory as just who these people are and what are they doing, what do they want. And when you're then saying all these provocative things like there are no other gods but ours, and you need to follow this one, then that's disturbing as well. So they're hard to identify. They could be absolutely anywhere, which readily feeds suspicion, fear. Tacitus may mention elsewhere, you have Aulus Plautius' wife being involved in some sort of questionable religion. Might be Christianity, might be Judaism, might be something else. We're not quite sure. There have been different interpretations. But that's the point, and this will be the point clearly on, is that anybody could become a Christian. And lots of people from all levels of society, even from the elite, do choose to do this. So you're starting to think, well, they could be anywhere. How many of them are there? They're so secretive. What are they up to? Where are they? Is there going to be a revolution? So the sense these are very much outsiders that are marking themselves out as outsiders and then doing strange things secretly, all of which disturbs the Romans. So let's move on a little bit, because the next fascinating piece of evidence we have, and some of the best for the state's attitudes towards an unusual group like the Christians, come from the reign of Trajan and the governorship of the younger Pliny of Bithynia. Now, we'll do a session on provincial governorship that'll look at Pliny in some detail and contrast his experience with Cicero's and Cilicia, because they're the two cases where you've got a fairly detailed view from their letters of what a governor is up to and what his priorities are, or at least what he chooses to present as his most important priorities. So it's 111, 113 AD. Bithynia is normally a senatorial province governed by a proconsul. Thank you, Gus. And yeah, I know. What do you want? All right, I've got a cat sitting there just staring at me. Now, you've already had your breakfast. Right. There's been a succession of prosecutions of governors of Bithynia by the local aristocracies. They've got very good at complaining about governors. There are all sorts of problems within the area. Lots of cities are in very dire financial straits. They're bankrupting themselves. They've been building or planning big projects they haven't completed. Things aren't working. Pliny is sent there in an extraordinary capacity as a legatus, a representative of the emperor. Pliny has legal experience, he has financial experience. When he'd done his military service, he seems to be mainly regulating the finances of the provincial army. It was early on. So he's sent there almost as a specialist and as Trajan's man to Bithynia to re-establish the proper government, so that then senatorial proconsuls selected by lot can take over again. He in fact dies while he's out there, so he doesn't succeed, which means that Book 10, which consists almost entirely of his letters from Bithynia, is published posthumously, and since it includes many replies from the Emperor Trajan and letters to Trajan, it's pretty clear that it is published with official approval. The emperor is happy, and it's really being presented. There is a whole genre you get in this early 2nd century AD and through part of the Second Sophistic that are, in a sense, sort of how to do things manuals. So This is time soon afterwards. Arrian will be writing his Tactica about infantry and cavalry tactics. The infantry tactics are rather archaic. His Ectaxis, he goes around the Black Sea and inspection there as governor, looking at various outposts and what's going on. You have his battle order against the Alans, that sort of thing. There is generally this feeling, it's part of this sense, and the tone of it shows that this is very much what the emperor, or one particular emperor, Trajan, wants his governors to do, how governors should behave, how they should do things properly. So therefore it gives you very much the official attitude, what the state wants, and how someone like Trajan, who is perceived as a very good emperor, wants the Roman Empire to function. So it's very much a theoretical work, and you've also got, you could extend in a different way, people like Suetonius around this time are writing the 12 Caesars that judge emperors, which are the good ones, which are the bad ones, and which are the particular virtues and vices that they display, and how far can Augustus be a good emperor, even though there's a few bits that are pretty dodgy. Vespasian's personality can improve, he can be a better emperor than we'd expected, other people might deteriorate. Tacitus has rather similar themes in the Annals in particular, quite probably in the histories, but of course we only really have the histories for the Civil War period and a little bit afterwards, to part of 70. We don't get the proper his account of the Flavians, and it'd be fascinating to know what he actually said about Vespasian himself, let alone Titus, and of course particularly Domitian, and the nature of the Domitian's overthrow at the end. It's quite interesting. Tertullian, the Christian apologist, not too much later, will quote Pliny and Trajan's letters from this book as evidence for his particular case. So again, it shows this is widely available. This is something, again, it's this emphasis, because after all, Pliny is dead. It helps his reputation. This is clearly something, and one suspects a lot of the earlier letters as well, the way they're selected. It's clearly meant to be on the model of Cicero. These are letters from a great orator, politician of the Republic, the old days, the 1st century BC, living his life. Pliny is a counterpart, even though the focus of these letters is quite different in many respects. There's not much about elections in it in the same way they dominate Cicero. It's showing you how you can be a good Roman, a good senator in an age of emperors. So that's quite an important thing. Anyway, we'll talk more about this in due course. The situation is as follows. Pliny is going on the rounds of the cities, as a Roman governor does. Again, look at how it all works in more detail in the sections on provincial governorship. And he goes from city to city, he sets up assizes, effectively, where he's the senior magistrate. He's pretty much judge and jury, because in most cases it's a question of his decision, where there are problems that the locals have not been able to settle, and they're appealing to a higher authority, in this case the Roman state. If in some cases, Pliny doesn't feel he can deal with this, or they're not satisfied with them, they can end up appealing even further to the emperor, but that might take a rather long time. In one of them, it's not named, Christians are brought, perhaps it's more than one, are brought before him by locals. So, key thing, this is not the Roman state initiating a hunt for Christians. That's important, we'll come back to that later on. This is local authorities, the body that runs the city, and this is of course how the Roman Empire works, is that in most cases people run their own affairs. Your local elites, your local systems, your laws, your magistrates, they administer things day to day, they run the justice system, all of this sort of thing. But there are cases where they have a problem, and either they don't feel they know how to deal with it, or they don't want to be responsible for dealing with it. They would prefer the Roman governor to rule. So once some have been arrested, there is a whole spate of accusations against other people who are brought in and said, well, you're a Christian and you need to be arrested as well. Pliny starts to investigate the crimes, and let's look at this a little bit. I have never been present at an examination of Christians. Consequently, I do not know the nature of the extent of the punishments usually meted out to them, nor the grounds for starting an investigation, and how far it should be pressed. So we'll come back to that quote in a moment. Pliny investigates, and again, this is where you start to get a sense of all the same sort of rumours of what was going on at these clandestine meetings that you've encountered with Livy talking about the Bacchic cult back in the 2nd century BC. Rumours of sexual orgies, basically, people getting up to all sorts of things in the dark. Perhaps are more understandable when you get rumours of cannibalism, of human sacrifice, of eating babies, this sort of thing. Now, obviously, where you have a ritual like the communion as it will develop, of talking about eating flesh and drinking blood, then somebody overhearing that might well jump to the wrong conclusions. So it's, there's an element where some of what they're doing is clearly can seem very, very strange, but it's also that sense that they're doing this in the dark. Why are they doing this in the dark and in secret? What have they got to hide? And this is not a cult that we know about, that's been doing this for generation after generation. And some of those have their secret practices, but you know who the priests are, you know where they meet, you know what they're up to. Everybody has a sense of where this fits into the world. This is new. This is something that has arrived. Suddenly, apparently increasing numbers of people are doing things that seem strange, seem weird and new. And you don't know who they are, you don't quite know what they're doing. So Pliny investigates the crimes and finds no evidence of any of this. He doesn't find any evidence for criminal behaviour as such. Only excessive superstition is what he describes it, prava superstitio. This idea that, they're just a bit over the top. They're getting obsessed with certain things that any good citizen doesn't need to worry about. So he then describes to Trajan what he's going to do, because obviously these people have been arrested by the local authorities. It's his job as judge, as I say, judge and jury, to decide what to do with them. And he's not entirely sure. This is not something he's encountered before, so he's emphasizing, and again writing to Trajan saying, I don't know what to do. This is what I've decided. Is this right? Is this not? So, for the moment, this is the line I have taken with all persons brought before me on the charge of being Christians. I have asked them in person if they are Christians, and if they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, with a warning of the punishment awaiting them. If they persist, I order them to be led away for execution, for, whatever the nature of their admission, I am convinced that their stubbornness and unshakable obstinacy ought not to go unpunished. There have been others similarly fanatical who are Roman citizens. I have entered them on the list of persons to be sent to Rome for trial. So Pliny's incredibly subtle interrogation technique is to ask the person directly, are you a Christian? They get 3 goes at this. So the right answer as far as he's concerned is, no, I'm not. Or maybe I was, but I'm not anymore. And if you say that, you can go free. There's no problem, basically. We'll come back to that in a moment. However, if you say, yes, I am a Christian, then, Pliny says, think very carefully. Are you a Christian? Ask them a second time, and then a third time, reminding them of, this is going to be punished. And if they say 3 times they are a Christian, he's quite happy to have them sent off to be executed. And it's obstinacy as far as he's concerned. Why are they so stupid? He doesn't really have any concern for what they actually think and believe and what they do in the confines of their own home privately. What he's concerned about is they have come before a Roman governor, and presumably there's some sort of perception that the religion has been outlawed from Nero onwards. I mean, we don't know the full legal status, but it's a sense that a Roman governor has come and said, are you a Christian? When you've said yes, he said, well, you you really ought not to be. This is not good for the state. Think again. Are you really sure? And if they say 3 times, well, they're so stupid, they're so obstinate, then just execute them. It's very casual, and it's really not that interested in what they actually believe or are doing. Now he continues, now that I've begun to deal with the problem, as so often happen, the charges are becoming more widespread and increasing in variety. An anonymous pamphlet has been circulated which contains the names of a number of accused persons. Amongst those I considered that I should dismiss any who denied that they were or ever had been Christians, when they had repeated after me a formula of invocation to the gods and had made offerings of wine and incense to your statue, and furthermore had reviled the name of Christ, none of which things I understand any genuine Christian can be induced to do. So you don't quite get to go free. You've basically got to give public proof, recanting any faith or saying I've never had it, and showing that you do the sort of things that any decent inhabitant of the empire, whether you're provincial, whether you're a Roman citizen, ought to do quite happily. You make a sacrifice, you offer to the emperor's statue, you show your loyalty to the state, to Rome, to its traditional gods, and you revile the name of Christ. That's it. Doesn't matter what you do afterwards. You can go home and go back to being Christian if you want. Pliny doesn't care. He's not going looking for you. But you've got to publicly make a display of accepting the empire, the authority of the emperor and its gods. And that's it. It isn't any more complicated than that. And he's clearly, because of what he's learned, he doesn't think they've actually done anything wrong other than this parva superstitio, this excessive superstition. And this. Others said that they had ceased to be Christians, and also declared that the sum total of their guilt or error amounted to no more than this, that they met regularly before dawn on a fixed day to chant verses alternately among themselves in honour of Christ as if to a god, and also to bind themselves by oath, not for any criminal purposes, but to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, to commit no breach of trust, not to deny a deposit when called upon to restore it. After this ceremony it had been their custom to disperse and reassemble later to take food of an ordinary, harmless kind. But they had in fact given this practice up since my edict issued on the instructions which banned all political societies. So a lot of people are saying, well, we just did this, it was harmless. And Pliny clearly is convinced that these are not some sinister group that are murdering people, conducting human sacrifice, getting involved in, promiscuity on a grand scale, all this sort of thing. They're simply meeting to do what he considers to be some fairly daft rituals, but actually what they're saying and what he's letting them claim is that they're taking oaths to be effectively good members of society. None of these things are something that a Roman would find reprehensible, whether or not they actually adhere to this, but this is the ideal for anybody, that you're not going to steal, you're not going to commit adultery, you're not going to break trust, deny a deposit, called upon to restore it. All very, very sort of, part of being a good citizen, part of being a good member of this particular city, this community, all this sort of thing. So let's come on to what Trajan says about this in reply. Because as is usually the case, he says, Pliny, yes, you've done the right thing, with a few sort of details here and there. So, you have followed the right procedure, my dear Pliny, in your examination of cases of persons charged with being Christians. These people must not be hunted out. If they're brought before you and the charge against them is proved, they must be punished. So it's the attitude of the state seems a little odd to us, in that basically, don't go looking for these people. However, if the locals arrest them and bring them to you, then you punish them. And that punishment extends to execution if they don't say, no, I'm not a Christian, or I'm not anymore. So it's not that the Roman Empire is actively going looking for Christians and considers them to be a threat. What bothers the imperial administration is if the local communities consider them to be a threat. So if the locals get bothered, then we need to do something about it, and we don't particularly like this group of weirdos, so arrest them, execute them if they're not bright enough to deny their faith and just go home and get on with their lives, or sufficiently respectful of the authority, the majesty of the Roman governor to do what he tells you. Basically he said, this is what you need to do to be a good member of our empire, so I've given you 3 chances to do this. If you can't take the hint, then that's your problem. So it's very interesting, and that's the pattern. Pliny has only started this because the locals have complained. The locals have arrested Christians, and Pliny talks later on that you can see the temples are busier again, traditional cults are busier again. Basically this sort of fad for this wacky, alien, trendy religion has died out. People are getting back to normal. There is an association that we'll get later on with when things are bad, you look for a fringe group to blame. And of course, this is a fairly common form of human behaviour. So Pliny has come to a province that's in disorder, where successive governors have been condemned for corruption, whether rightly or not. Most of the city's finances are in a state, projects aren't being fulfilled, cities are competing with each other but not doing very well. He's sent there to sort things out. One aspect of sorting things out, and this is one letter from Pliny, one reply from Trajan out of over 100 in the book. it's not, this is not his main concern. This is one thing he comes along. It's a long letter, which is interesting, probably because this is putting out an official view of this is how authorities should think about this cult group that we maybe mostly don't know too much about, because how many are there, where are they, but it comes down to this: when locals want a group to blame, when things are going wrong and they think, well, there is, of course, that direct correlation, even stronger than today, that if things are going badly, then you've upset the gods or goddesses. And the traditional ones that have always kept you safe, kept you prosperous, they're the ones you've got to be most concerned with. This is a new religion that's denying those, that's challenging those, that's drawing people away. It meets in secret, you don't know who they are, they could be your neighbour, they could even be your family, and they could be trying to corrupt your children and tell them, this is what you've got to believe, not what you've been told by your parents, all this sort of thing. So that's the fear, that's the sort of level of hysteria that's there, that prompts a reaction of, well, let's go and arrest these people, and then the governor comes along and he'll execute some or let them go. The Roman citizens being sent off to Rome if they haven't denied it, because they have that right. So it's not the empire setting out and saying, well, there's this new cult called Christianity spreading, don't like the look of this is a threat to the empire, hunt it out everywhere, eradicate this. They're basically not bothered. And if it comes to the point, if the locals get bothered and you're brought before the governor, then you might well end up being executed. But he isn't going to look for you, and he isn't going to believe anonymous pamphlets. That's a sort of bad thing. That can lead to all sorts of ill feeling and informers and all this sort of thing. That's the sort of stuff that happens under bad emperors, under bad governors, not when the state works properly. Everything's got to be fair and above board, and people have got to be given a fair chance. So even if Nero has brought in some sort of law that makes Christianity illegal, then they're not really that bothered about enforcing it. It's only if it's locally becomes an issue that the state steps in, the governor steps in, but he has to be asked. He isn't going out there looking. And the impression is that in most cases people aren't that bothered. Now, that may be because there aren't too many Christians around. It may be because if everything else is going reasonably well locally, then you're not worried, you're not nervous, you're not looking for this. There seem to be outbreaks of hysteria, and you could fit this in witch trials and all sorts of things like that in later periods. It's that sort of thing. That's the pattern for persecutions really until the middle of the 3rd century AD. They are very much local issues, local reaction to problems, let's blame some weirdos, and then the state steps in and executes them. Or lets them go if they say, no, I'm not doing that anymore. It's not, almost never are these initiated by the Roman authorities. It's always by local authorities, and usually the city leaders, because that's the people you rely upon. It still appears to be primarily an urban cult, or at least the areas where it becomes an issue are in cities where these authorities do. You could think of the Lugdunum, Lyon, in Gaul, modern-day France, under Marcus Aurelius, where there's a large-scale persecution. It again begins in the context of plague. This catastrophe has happened. Natural to think, well, what do we do? How do we get the gods back on our side to stop this? Then, well, look, we've let these people exist. One thing that is striking there, and increasingly, is that over time people know who the Christians are. There might be some who get accused that all secretly you are, but the Christians appear to become more and more open, to the point where in the 3rd century you have talk of churches in eastern cities that are, within sight of the imperial residence and something when the emperor's there. Bishops parading around with all the pomp and panoply of local magistrates and local officials. Not all, but there are some. These are clearly visible. And it's only when it becomes an issue. So you have this, and you get the martyrdom literature, which gives you a flavour of this. Let's see. So, from the martyrdom of Polycarp, but one called Quintus, when he saw the beast, he was afraid. He was the one who had forced himself and others to come forward voluntarily. Him, the proconsul, after many entreaties, persuaded to take the oath and offer sacrifice. Here you've got a case, again, it's interesting in these martyrdom literatures. This is somebody within the church who is a real sort of blowhard, basically, and boasts about how faithful he is, and when there is suspicion of the Christians and there are arrests, he sort of persuades everybody, let's just go, let's make a public demonstration, let's show who we are, defy them to arrest us, all this sort of thing. Lots of people follow him. When it comes under pressure, when he actually starts seeing the lions and the others out there, he's about to decide maybe that wasn't such a great idea and recants his faith and is allowed to go free. So you get those stories in. As I say, the heroism of the martyrs is presented within the context of others who fail in their faith, but also others who visit them in prisons. There's almost an element where you get the sort of hysteria where people are arrested and then afterwards nobody's really looking anymore. So you've got some criminals that might take a while before they're actually executed, and they've been condemned as Christians, but others can come in, can get food to them, visit them in prison, this sort of thing, without being arrested in the same way. You also have that sense of how traumatic this can be for families. Again, Perpetua and Felicitas in North Africa. While we were still under arrest, my father, out of love for me, tried to persuade I've lost my page, me and shake my resolution. Her father tries to get her to persuade the sacrifice. Governor says to her, look, the father's come there, have pity on your father's grey head, have pity on your infant son, offer the sacrifice for the welfare of the emperors. So, this is a case where the family, understandably, they don't want to lose their kid, their child, and as any parent knows, whatever age that little boy or baby girl becomes, they're always that baby to you in your mind. There's that element where you can't move beyond that. But again, it comes back to this: Christians could be anybody, and that's something that the Romans are uncomfortable with for a long time. And it could be people from the top of society, and this is someone the governor's willing to indulge, as a man of some importance. Some of these martyrs are aristocrats. But again, it's, she refuses. Day of their victory dawn, they march from the prison to the amphitheatre joyfully as though they were going to heaven. So it's usually that result of problems in the wider area, worries, and let's find a group that we can blame, let's deal with this, and maybe the gods will be happy again and we don't have to worry about this much. The legal position is distinct from other crimes in that the crime for which people are executed is being a Christian. It's not, I have been a Christian, so I've committed that crime before, but now I've said, no, I don't want to do that anymore, and you perform those rituals, you offer to the emperor, you make these sacrifices, this sort of thing. The stuff, again, it's the same formula as Pliny, very much so. But it's like, somebody saying, well, I did rob a bank last week, but I've decided I'm not going to rob banks anymore, so you'd be let off. It isn't having been a Christian, it's being a Christian now when the authorities say to you, you shouldn't be, stop being a Christian and do these things to show you're not a Christian, in which case, fine. If you're no longer holding the beliefs, you're released, you don't suffer. You don't suffer for former crimes because it is not... It comes down to how you behave and your attitude and what you're thinking and how you are demonstrating that publicly. It's very much the public performance. So again, nobody's going to investigate what you do in the months and years to come. If you deny Christ, carry out these rituals and say, I'm not a Christian anymore, go home and become one again, then nobody's probably going to chase you. Nobody cares. It's all about what you're doing when authority challenges you and say, this is what a good member of the empire should do. If you don't, you will be punished. So what's the main reason for local hostility? And it comes back to things we've talked about before. The secretive nature of it. It's a secret society. Carries out weird rituals in private, again, cannibalism, all this sort of stuff. You get rumours, you'll get these exposés today of various cults, various groups, Freemasons, this sort of thing. What are they up to? What are they doing secretly? Are they controlling things? Are they manipulating behind the scenes? Any secret group, not secret group, but group that has elements of things that are done secretly causes suspicion, unless it's so old that everybody's used to this. There's also the division of communities and families. They're not a national group. They come from all levels of society. They can be men, they can be women, they can be boys, they can be girls, they can be rich, they can be poor, they can be slave or free. Again, we'll look at some curse tablets at a later point, and those formulae come in. That there's also the suspicion that, from a Roman point of view, they pick on the vulnerable. So they pick on the less intelligent, those of weaker character. So there is a perception, and you can see this in the Book of Acts, that there seem to be a lot of women joining Christian groups from early on. You've also got the infirm, you've got children, and of course, because the Christians have this emphasis on charity, looking after the poor and all this sort of thing, there can be the sense to outsiders, well, everyone who can't be bothered to work goes off and says, oh, my life's been hard, and they'll be helped by the Christians, and that isn't good for anybody. So you have this perception that it's not proper, good, noble Romans who are doing this. The problem is that over time, more and more of those will become sympathetic. And you have a couple of martyrdoms of soldiers where it usually seems to boil over in a crisis. So it's competition over promotion. Somebody loses out and then they condemn the person who got the step in rank as a Christian. And then that soldier is again given the offer of, oh, you can say you're not a Christian and everything will be fine. And the general impression is that people have probably known their beliefs all the way through, and it hasn't bothered anybody up to this point. Something else provokes this, turns it into an issue, and then you have to go through the proper procedure of saying, no, I'm not, and proving it. And then, again, you can go and believe what you like the rest of the time, it doesn't matter. But men who refuse to do this, so they're not suddenly deciding they can't kill, they can't take an oath to the emperor and all these sorts of things. They've been happily doing that. Everyone's been happy serving alongside them for a very long time. It becomes an issue. Then you have to go through the procedure. So it's this very Roman thing of the state doesn't want too much from you, but every now and again it expects you to play by the rules, toe the line, do what, show that you are loyal. And the big thing is the threat to communities. Religion is everywhere in the ancient world, and within any city, any community, you have all the guilds, the clubs for trades, bakers, leather workers, this sort of thing. These would tend to have a cultic aspect to them. Bear in mind, most sacrifices are you sacrifice an animal, some small parts of it are given to the gods, but then the bulk of it and the meat is eaten as a part of a feast. Now, think back to some of Paul's letters and this sort of thing in the New Testament, where it's, should Christians eat food offered to idols and all this thing. It's in this context where you're part of your daily life, part of the guild, the club with which you're associated, that would be part of it. Most of the time, nobody thinks too much of it. In the same way that, there are aspects of ritual superstition, that are still carried on. I assume there's still a formal Latin grace before formal hall in Oxford College. It doesn't require you to be a Christian to stand there and listen to it. You can eat the food, whatever it is, but it's that tradition. So there's elements of that where people do things they don't really think about that much, or the symbolism of them, as well as others where they clearly do. So there's a fear that when you start to have people who stand out and say, I'm not going to do this, then everybody gets a bit suspicious, because they're rocking the boat, basically. They're doing things that have been done generation after generation. It comes back to this. This is why we're prosperous. This is why we're successful. We don't have to believe too actively that the God is really helping us. It's just, let's not take any chances. Deities are very important. Rituals, festivals, parading of statues, sacrifices within the life of the wider community, let alone groups within it. So any group that seems to be, even if they're not they're not staging a protest or anything, but they don't seem to be actively taking part, that can start to cause suspicion, especially when other things go wrong. And at this stage, whilst there's, you have priests developing within the Christian system, bishops and all this sort of thing, they're not, other cults have very clear priesthoods that tend to be drawn overwhelmingly from the wealthy, from the aristocracy. And it's part of the way they lead that community and run things. It's part of the administration, part of the sense of how we function as a group, whether it's a city, whether it's a tribe, whatever it might be. And that the Roman state relies upon that working, because it doesn't want to come down and administer your life on a day-to-day basis. So religious festivals are a big part of this. Again, think of, the Book of Acts and the Greatest Artemis of the Ephesians, that riot there of the silversmiths. The way it's presented by the Christian author is that they're worried that their trade in selling little statuettes to people will fade if everybody stops believing in Artemis and starts believing in this Christian god. There will be elements of that, and there will be elements where, as with any group of human beings, some of the Christians will be unusually provocative, perhaps damn rude as far as groups would be concerned. You will get things stirred up, and human beings being human beings, it can happen on either side or both as to who's responsible. But most of the time, it doesn't happen. The Christians are there, and they're accepted. They might be thought of as a bit weird, a bit strange, not particularly liked, but they aren't a threat that anyone's bothered about and wants to start arresting people and executing people. So it tends to be moments of crisis where that occurs. Within this, why does the church survive? Mostly because it is so, this persecution is not concerted. It is not a clear effort from the state to say, we don't like this group and we're going to eradicate it. In a way that they do, for instance, with the Druidic cult. And they do, at least to their satisfaction, with that version of the Bacchic cult in the 2nd century BC. There are occasional outbreaks of persecution. From the 250s onwards, you start to get, during the 3rd century crisis, emperors worried about things, and therefore they want everybody within the empire to swear an oath of loyalty to them. When Christians say they can't, then that brings them to the fore, and they start to persecute the Christians, because that's the only time. It takes until then, so 2 centuries plus into the existence of Christianity as a movement, before the state starts organised empire-wide attempts to suppress the cult, by which time it's very big. There are lots of them, and not everybody's convinced it's a good idea. And the emperors involved don't tend to last very long anyway, because nobody's lasting very long as emperor at that time. But when the persecutions occur earlier on, they're sporadic, they're occasional, they're very local. Rarely do they even spread to a whole province. Usually it's city-based, it's community-based, within perhaps a broader area, but not... It's certainly not, right, let's go and see if everybody in the western provinces is doing this, we've got to do something about it. And of course, in contrast, the integration of the Roman system, the Pax Romana, encourages the spread of ideas like this, just as it does trade and everything else. You have a common imperial culture and languages that, with good communications. Urban culture, the cities are quite small. The pattern you have in Acts of Paul and other Christian missionaries, they go to the synagogue first. If they get chucked out of there, they go to the marketplace and talk to everybody. They're densely populated. There's lots of groups dotted around, so that emphasis on an urban cult is probably justified. There's also an attraction to a lot of the ideas. Go back to Pliny's statement about what the Christians are pledging to do. None of those things are anathema to the Romans or to Greeks or to most people in the ancient world. You tell the truth. You don't renege on debts. You don't commit adultery, all this sort of thing. Now, the fact that plenty of people of all communities do these things, the ideal is that you shouldn't, and most people don't do it, even though they realise, well, this is going to happen. But those are, broadly speaking, what most would consider to be good things. There's also an attraction of the ideas. Quite a lot of what the Christians have been talking about, do so, isn't so very different, at least superficially, to a lot of philosophical ideas. So the Stoics, for quite a long time, have been pushing this sense that, yes, you you talk about Demeter or Juno or different gods, goddesses, this sort of thing as aspects, but there is essentially one divine thing, one God thing, of which these are just aspects that you see, one looking at it from a particular point of view. So that there's an element where people have been considering almost a monotheistic idea for quite a while. The Christians will sometimes emphasize, well, you say, well, we're new, but we're drawing on the Jewish tradition that's really old, so that makes us acceptable. It also appeals to everybody, any class, anybody. You can be a slave, you can be a freedman, you can be a citizen, you can be an aristocrat, you can be dirt poor, you can still become a Christian. The message is obviously that of salvation, of the afterlife, of, again, it's very personal, very emotional, so that's rather strong. And within that, you celebrate martyrdom, so the people who stand up for the faith are held up in a heroic light, and there's that sense that, in the same way Tacitus talks about the crowd feeling sympathy for the Christians when Nero's killing them for what they consider to be unfair reasons, and the bravery with which they face that Roman state, the Roman tradition has respect for courage, even if they consider it to be in a bad cause. You know, it's we have the same borderline you get nowadays between courage and fanaticism. You know, people willing to die for their beliefs. We can sort of fanaticism, oh well, you know, it's not quite the thing, but nevertheless, it's impressive that people will do that. So you have. The other thing I think comes back to this, there is a danger that we approach the study of the Christian church, and as I say, particularly as we go on into later antiquity and the evolution into the state religion of Christianity, that we see it from essentially a theological perspective. Now, whatever your personal beliefs, most people today will know what a Christian should believe, what the basic ideals are. You accept Jesus as the Son of God, crucified, rises from the dead, offers forgiveness from sin, salvation, those basic aspects. And within that is that clear principle that there is one God. There is not Jupiter, Juno, Thor, Odin, goodness knows what out there as well, doing their own thing, and that they could help you if you were nice to them. That this is the only path. You know, this is exclusive. This is the only way to salvation. However, there's an interesting story. Now, it's about Severus Alexander, one of the Severan dynasty, and it's in the Historia Augusta. So this is a much later source written in late 4th century about a 3rd century emperor that talks about him having his sort of own little portable shrine that he would carry around with him, statues of various gods, but he also had one of Jesus. Now, what that would look like is an interesting thing to consider in a 3rd century context. But I think, again, we think in a monotheistic way, or we think in a very clear, you believe in religion, you don't believe in religion. It's essentially a sort of simple choice. In a polytheistic world, adding an extra god to your sense of how the heavens work, how what's out there, the divine powers, is not such a big deal. So you have to wonder whether there are quite a lot of people in the broader ancient world, especially as things develop, as Christians become more numerous, more open, and are saying things that basically you think, yeah, that sounds okay. That's reasonable. I like the sound of that. You can add Jesus effectively to your pantheon of gods and goddesses without feeling you've got to give the others up. And you could even argue, no offense meant to anybody, but there's an element where the developments of rituals surrounding saints later on will almost allow for this, that you can still have somebody who specialises in, say, travel or your particular requirement to look after you, and you can offer to them and pray to them, rather than just doing everything directly to God. So we think in too modern a way, we think in too theological way, rather than just in a sort of sociological sense, that there are probably lots of Christian sympathisers out there, and that number spreads. So even if the number of people who are, as we would understand it, more or less sort of theologically sound Christians remains comparatively small and remains a minority even into Constantine's day, it makes more sense of Constantine's adoption of Christianity more openly as a political thing. I mean, again, you've got whole questions of beliefs, and one day we'll extend and we'll go into later antiquity as well, and we'll do this sort of thing. If there are quite a lot of people out there who are not automatically saying, oh yeah, he likes the Christians, oh they're terrible, I must hate them, but actually, oh yeah, they're okay, but doesn't mean that they are fully signed up to everything. It's just that they've taken on a bit of it, and they think, oh yeah, that's all right. You have to think in a different way to understand this. In the same way, Paganus, countryman, somebody from the Pagus, becomes the name for someone who isn't a Christian. That's not really a concept you can impose on the earlier period, because everybody, the sort of default setting is that you have lots of different gods and goddesses. There is that idea, it's country bumpkins, and in the countryside, the traditional cults remain much stronger, and it's only in the cities that the church has much say and much role. On the other hand, you could say, people from cities are inclined to look down on those from the countryside in any period. You can see it in, Athenian comedy. You can see it in any era, that it might just be that it's sort of country bumpkin thing, rather than necessarily strictly religious that they don't believe that, or they don't believe it quite so neatly. So you do have an impression that the numbers become quite substantial early on, and you could even trace this back to the groups of God-fearers and others that seem to be sort of on the fringes of Judaism that are encountered in the Book of Acts and this sort of thing. There are lots of people who are sympathetic, have taken on bits of it, but might be doing other things as well. And that, of course, adds to the whole confusion of what you see archaeologically. You might still be making your offerings to the traditional gods, but you might modify your behavior. You might also pray to Jesus, pray to the Jewish God, and act in certain ways. It's probably a mistake. We understand so little about ancient religion that we sometimes impose different rules on it, and we'll almost say, well, it's not about morality, it's all about status, it's about power, it's all this sort of thing. Again, we'll come on to all of this when we deal with that in more detail. Christianity wouldn't have succeeded unless a lot of what these people were saying struck, was sort of within the pool of what people consider to be, oh yeah, that's a good idea, that makes sense, I buy that, I like that. So quite a lot of what they were saying, and this will be the argument you'll get from the Christian apologists, saying that basically Christians are very good citizens. And while you do get some groups that seem to move towards pacifism, the fact you've got in the martyrdoms Roman soldiers and others, it's a very varied group, and there are lots of people who don't necessarily interpret things in the same way. But it is something that builds up and that has broad appeal. And there might be extreme forms that would be hard to follow, but there are lots where a lot of people can buy into this. And the sense of right and wrong, concepts of proper behaviour, of sinfulness, of all this sort of thing, enough people have to buy in and think, oh yeah, that makes sense. Which rather suggests that it isn't perhaps, in terms of many of the moral values, many of the ideas, quite so different from the way a lot of people before that have considered this is how you should live a good life. And of course that's concern for philosophers, for others elsewhere. You've got the whole question of the mystery cults, Mithraism, Isis, all this sort of thing. That's another issue again. So anyway, as usual, I've rambled off the point to a great extent. The main thing, key things to take away, is that the pattern of persecution of the Christians right until the middle of the 3rd century is rare. It's localized, and it's based around local problems. It is not an empire-wide thing. To some extent an exception with Nero, though it's not clear how far he pushes things beyond Rome. But it might be that Christianity becomes illegal at that time, but we don't really know. But after that, it's people like Pliny coming along as a Roman governor saying, well, I don't really know what to do with this because I've never seen this before. So arrests, executions are rare. Even when arrests are made, quite a lot of people get away with it just by saying, well, no, I'm not, I'm not anymore. And this, of course, will become when you get the empire-wide persecutions that will lead to schisms within the church, where people actually say, no, I'm not, for when the, the officials come around, but then assume they can go back and be a bishop again next week, or whatever it might be, and accepted back within the church when others have gone and hidden somewhere or have been arrested and suffered. These are human beings, and they are human beings on all sides who get frightened, who get nervous, who lash out at unusual groups. So the Christians are unusual. They stand out. They stand out because, in a sense, they don't stand out. You don't know who they are. You don't know which race they belong to. They could be anybody. But most of the time, in most areas, nobody's that bothered by them. And it's very difficult to estimate numbers. But I think we have to, when we think of it, think of a fairly long-term spread, fairly substantial numbers, but they are made more significant because there are lots of people on the fringes who've said, oh yeah, I like some of this, I don't mind that, even though from a strict point of view they're probably still doing other traditional things as well that would conflict with a purely Christian lifestyle. So it's messier because these are human beings, and within, again, comes back to this polytheistic idea that you can accept another god, and it's only in some cases where that becomes unreasonable. But basically speaking, the empire is not bothered about Christians unless locals become bothered about Christians. And if local authorities, which tends to mean the elite in any area, and even if that's because they're doing a Nero and there's some other problem and they basically say, who can we blame? Let's find, the Christians, they're strange, nobody likes them, let's arrest them. Even though nobody might like them, most of the time nobody's that bothered about what they're doing either. So that's the pattern you see again and again, to the point where, as I say, later on, when there is a persecution, everybody knows who the Christians are and where they are. And by that time, into the 3rd century, you are getting more churches that are openly there. And people know, they know just where to find these groups. So it's a gradual spread, but it is, it's very revealing when you look particularly at the Pliny and Trajan's response as to how the Roman state thinks about this group. And the main moral of this is that they don't think about them very much at all. And they're not really that bothered about them at all. It's only if it's causing upset in a region, therefore we want the province to be settled, we want the province to be stable, we want it to be causing us no trouble and paying its taxes. So, okay, if the locals are upset about Christians, let's go and arrest and execute Christians. But, otherwise, not really our problem, not really that bothered. Anyway, that's the take on that. Hopefully that's been of interest. Hopefully it's been a bit more coherent than it's felt. But in my usual way, I've been rambling, partly because I'm thinking of other things with the book to finish and all this sort of thing. But anyway, hope that's of interest. Thanks for watching.